Matteo Santana, CEO of a supermarket chain valued at 800 million euros, was conducting his monthly inspection at the Vallecas establishment when he witnessed a scene that would change his life forever. A young woman with a baby in her arms and a 4-year-old girl by the hand approached the checkout with 3 items: powdered milk, diapers, and a loaf of bread. When the cashier told her the total was 27, the woman counted and recounted the coins in her purse. Then, with her voice broken by shame, she said, "I'm sorry, I have to return the milk." Matteo watched as that mother returned the can of powdered milk while her baby cried from hunger, and the little girl tugged at her skirt, asking when they were going to eat. In that moment, the millionaire who had built an empire selling food to Spanish families realized a devastating truth. While he counted millionaire profits, some mothers had to choose between feeding their children and paying rent. What he did after that encounter was not just a gesture of charity, but the beginning of a revolution that would transform Spain and the lives of thousands of families. But first, he had to face the darkest secret of his success. Matteo Santana had never set foot in one of his supermarkets as a simple customer. At 42 years old, the man who had transformed a small neighborhood store into a chain of 347 establishments throughout Spain knew his businesses only through quarterly reports, profit margins, and sales statistics that arrived punctually at his office in the penthouse of the Madrid headquarters. This November morning, he had decided to make a surprise inspection of the Vallecas supermarket, one of the sales points with below-average performance that he was considering closing. Dressed in his usual charcoal gray Armani suit with Italian shoes that cost more than one of his employees' monthly salary, he walked through the establishment's aisles, mentally noting every detail that didn't meet corporate standards. His life was a perfect mechanism of efficiency and profits. He got up every morning at 5:30 in his 400-metru chalet in La Moraleja. He exercised for 45 minutes in his private gym. He read financial reports during breakfast served by domestic staff and arrived at the office before 8 to begin a workday that rarely ended before 10 p.m. He had no family. His marriage had ended 5 years earlier when his wife got tired of being married to a man who measured everything in terms of turnover and annual growth. His supermarkets were scientifically designed to maximize customer spending. Essential products located at the back of aisles to force consumers to traverse the entire establishment, special offers on impulse items, studied distribution to confuse and slow movements, increasing the probabilities of unplanned purchases. Matteo didn't see customers as people, but as consumption units that generated useful data to optimize income and margins. That morning, he was precisely analyzing the location of the dairy section. Children's products were strategically placed next to luxury goods to create a psychological contrast that pushed parents to spend more. When he noticed a scene that he initially interpreted as a normal case of customer management. A young woman approached the checkout with tired steps, carrying a baby who couldn't be more than 3 months old and guiding by the hand a blonde girl of about 4 years old who dragged her feet with the typical childish fatigue of someone who had walked too much. The woman was at most 25 years old. She wore a worn jacket that had seen better days and faded jeans. But what struck Matteo was the expression of determination mixed with desperation that illuminated her face. In the shopping cart, there were only 3 items arranged with almost religious care: a container of baby formula, a package of diapers, and a loaf of whole wheat bread. Matteo automatically noted the prices. The milk cost 14, the diapers 11, the bread 2, and he mentally calculated the total while the woman got in line at the checkout. The cashier, a woman of about 50, whom Matteo recognized from staff photos as Mrs. Rodriguez with 15 years of service in the company, scanned the items with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had made that gesture thousands of times. When the screen showed 27, the young mother opened a synthetic leather wallet so worn that you could see the marks of loose stitching. What followed was a scene that Matteo would relive in his mind for years to come. The woman began counting the coins with slightly trembling hands. 50 cents, 1, 2, 50 cents. Again she arranged them on the checkout belt, recounted them, grouped them by value, counted them again. The baby began to cry, that sharp and desperate cry of very small children who are hungry. While the older girl tugged at her mother's skirt, asking in a thin little voice when they would return home to eat, Matteo unconsciously approached, hiding behind the magazine display, fascinated by that mathematics of survival he had never seen so closely. The woman had exactly 1630. She was missing 1070 to complete the purchase, an insignificant sum for him, but evidently impossible for her. The cashier waited with professional patience, showing no judgment, but also no particular empathy. It was a scene she had probably seen many times in that neighborhood. Other customers began to queue behind the young mother, some looking at their watches with growing impatience. It was at that moment when the woman pronounced the words that would haunt Matteo for weeks. "I'm sorry, I have to return the milk." Her voice was broken not so much by shame as by a profound tiredness, as if she had hoped until the last moment to have enough money, but had always known it wouldn't be possible. She took the can of powdered milk and handed it to the cashier, who set it aside without comment. The screen now showed 13, bread and diapers. The woman counted her money again, this time with greater certainty, and gave it to the cashier along with 3 encrumpled bills she took from the back pocket of her jeans. While the cashier prepared the change and put the purchases in a plastic bag, the baby continued crying louder and louder. The little girl asked with devastating innocence, "Mama, what about the milk for little brother?" The mother crouched down to her, caressing her blonde hair, and whispered something Matteo couldn't hear, but which made the girl smile. Watching that scene, Matteo felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Shame. Not the social shame of being associated with something unpleasant, but the deep moral shame of someone who realizes he has lived in a bubble completely disconnected from reality. As they left the supermarket, the mother with the baby who screamed more and more desperately, the girl who jumped ignoring the tragedy that was being consumed, Matteo remained paralyzed among the magazines, realizing that this woman had just lived one of the most humiliating moments of her life in his supermarket, with his prices under his commercial empire. That night, in his silent and perfectly air-conditioned chalet, Matteo couldn't eat dinner. He couldn't stop thinking about that baby's cry, the innocent question of the little girl, the look of that mother who had to choose between feeding her son and buying diapers to prevent irritations. For the first time in 20 years of business career, the numbers in his reports seemed not abstract figures, but the reflection of real human lives. Of families who fought every day against poverty while he optimized profits. In the following days, Matteo couldn't concentrate on the usual financial reports. The image of that mother forced to return the milk continued tormenting him, transforming every business decision into a moral dilemma. During board of directors meetings, while executives discussed price increases for the following quarter, he saw the face of that little girl asking about milk for her little brother. He decided to return to the Vallecca supermarket, this time not as a CEO on inspection, but as a silent observer of the reality he had ignored all his life. He dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt, put on sunglasses and a baseball cap, and spent hours in the establishment's aisles studying customer behaviors with completely different eyes. What he saw shocked him. Mothers who calculated every cent before putting something in the cart. Elderly people who compared prices for entire minutes before choosing the most economical product. Entire families who divided through the aisles to optimize time and find the best offers. He had built an empire selling food, but now he understood that for many people, grocery shopping was a daily battle against the humiliation of poverty. On the second day of observation, he saw the same woman again. This time she was alone. She had evidently left the children somewhere and had in her hand a list written on a crumpled piece of paper. He followed her at a distance while she toured the establishment with precise movements, without wasting time in aisles that didn't serve her, only taking products on sale or cheap brands, controlling each price with the maniacal attention of someone who can't afford mistakes. At the checkout, she had 9 items: pasta, rice, milk, bread, a package of sausages, bruised bananas on sale, dish detergent, a package of diapers, and a box of children's paracetamol. The total was $23.40. This time, she had the exact money, which she counted twice before giving it to the cashier with a shy smile of triumph. Matteo followed her out of the supermarket, maintaining a respectful distance, and saw her walk for 15 minutes to a block of social housing from the 70s with peeling stucco and windows repaired with adhesive tape. He saw her climb 5 floors on foot. The elevator was obviously broken, with the shopping bags that visibly weighed on her thin arms. That night, Matteo called the personnel director and asked for information about the employees of the Vallecas establishment. He wanted to better understand the neighborhood, the clientele, the social situation of the area. What he discovered hit him like a punch in the stomach. 40% of the area's families lived below the poverty line. Youth unemployment exceeded 35%, and many of his most faithful customers were people who juggled to afford basic necessities. The personnel director, thinking the CEO was evaluating closing the sales point due to poor profitability, began listing the supermarket's problems: low margins, clientele with little purchasing power, increasing thefts. Matteo stopped him mid-speech, realizing that he himself had created a system that saw customer poverty as a problem to solve by closing stores instead of lowering prices. That night, in his silent chalet, Matteo made a decision that would change everything. He called his assistant and asked her to get him all the data on sales points located in low-income neighborhoods. He wanted precise numbers. How many families did they serve? What percentage of their income did they spend in his supermarkets? How many children went to bed without dinner because their parents couldn't afford to complete their shopping? The data that arrived in the following days was devastating. His supermarkets in poor neighborhoods had profit margins of 25% on children's products, double the European average. A family with 2 small children spent an average of $150 per month just on milk, diapers, and baby food, almost 20% of the area's average income. And the most shocking fact, according to market research commissioned by his own company, 30% of mothers had admitted to skipping meals to guarantee food for their children. Matteo realized that his success was literally built on the hunger of Spanish children. Every time he had raised prices to improve margins, he had condemned some family to impossible decisions between primary needs. His 800 million empire was stained by the cry of babies who couldn't be fed because milk cost too much for their mothers. The third time Matteo returned to the Vallecas supermarket, he had made a decision that his financial consultants would have defined as madness. He called an emergency meeting with all the staff and announced something revolutionary. All children's products would be sold at cost price, 0 profit margin. Additionally, every mother who couldn't complete shopping for her children could access an anonymous family fund. The director pointed out that this would destroy profitability. Matteo looked him in the eyes. Good, it was about time. In the following days, while the legal team structured the No Child Without Milk program, Matteo observed the first effects. The mother who had returned the milk came back the following Tuesday, unaware of the changes. At checkout, the total had been reduced by half. Thinking it was an error, the cashier explained the new business program. Matteo saw that mother break down crying with gratitude. For the first time in months, she could buy everything without having to choose. She left with 3 bags instead of 1, walking with light steps. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. The supermarket filled with families who came even from far away. Contrary to all predictions, sales increased 40% in 2 weeks. Families who saved on milk and diapers spent the money in other departments. The success in Vallecas convinced Matteo to revolutionize the entire company. He convened the board of directors, presenting the revolution of dignity. extending the program to all 347 supermarkets in the chain for all basic necessities: milk, bread, pasta, rice, over-the-counter medicine, sold at cost price for needy families. The reaction was devastating. The financial director calculated a 60% reduction in profits. The marketing manager spoke of unfair competition. The managing director threatened to resign. But Matteo had the Vallecas data: increased sales, customer loyalty, increased global turnover. Above all, he had thank you letters from families. The vote was tight: 6 against, 5 in favor, 1 abstention. Matteo, as majority shareholder, decided to go ahead despite management opposition. The implementation transformed the public perception of the Santana chain. Media told stories of families saved from food poverty. The deepest change occurred in Matteo himself. The man who optimized profits discovered a new satisfaction in the smiling faces of mothers. He personally visited all sales points, not to control numbers, but to listen to stories and understand needs. The transformation required sacrifices. He sold the chalet, liquidated the art collection, gave up the private jet. But each renunciation seemed insignificant compared to the joy of seeing fed children and mothers who didn't have to choose between dignity and survival. 1 year after implementing the revolution of dignity, Matteo faced consequences he hadn't foreseen, some wonderful and others devastating. His supermarket chain had become an international case study, analyzed by economics universities as an example of ethical capitalism. Delegations of businessmen arrived from all over Europe to understand how it was possible to combine profit and social justice. The final numbers were surprising even for Matteo. Despite the drastic reduction in margins on basic necessities, the company's global turnover had increased 35%. Families who previously shopped with anxiety and shame now frequented Santana supermarkets with confidence, spending money saved on essential products on other items. Customer loyalty had reached record levels, and marketing costs had been reduced practically to zero because positive word of mouth replaced any advertising. But success also had a high personal price. 6 board members resigned, selling their shareholdings and publicly accusing Matteo of betraying free market principles. Some competitors initiated a smear campaign, maintaining that the revolution of dignity was just a publicity maneuver, hiding tax evasion or other illegal activities. The hardest battle was with his ex-wife, who reappeared in his life with a lawsuit to obtain a larger share of assets, maintaining that his philanthropic follies were impoverishing goods that also belonged to her. But it was during this personal battle when Matteo had the encounter that definitively changed his life. In the Madrid courts, while waiting for the hearing for the case with his ex-wife, he noticed a young lawyer who was defending evicted families for free. She was beautiful, determined, and spoke of poor people's rights with a passion that immediately fascinated him. Her name was Elena Marquez. She was 30 years old and dedicated 60% of her legal time to unpaid cases for families in economic difficulty. When Matteo approached to introduce himself after the hearing, she immediately recognized him as the millionaire who gives milk to the poor, and looked at him with a distrust that completely disconcerted him. Elena had read in newspapers about his social initiatives, but remained skeptical about the real motives of a rich businessman who suddenly discovered himself a philanthropist. When Matteo asked if he could invite her for coffee to talk about his charitable initiatives, she dryly responded that she had no time for chats with millionaires seeking cheap redemption. The challenge was thrown. Matteo, who had conquered every professional objective he had set for himself, found himself for the first time in his life having to prove the sincerity of his motivations to a woman who wasn't impressed by his economic success, but wanted concrete proof of his social commitment. 2 years after the encounter with Elena, Matteo had transformed not only his company, but his entire existence. The lawyer's initial distrust had gradually transformed into respect and then into deep love born from daily sharing of commitment to the weakest. Elena had not only accepted becoming his life partner, but had also become director of the Santana Foundation, a non-profit organization that Matteo had created by dedicating 70% of his personal assets to fighting child poverty. Together, they had opened free dining rooms for families in difficulty, basic necessities distribution centers, and a microcredit program for single mothers wanting to start small business activities. Their marriage, celebrated privately in a small neighborhood church instead of the historic center cathedral, was followed by hundreds of families who had benefited from their social programs. There were no magazine photographers or VIP guests, but mothers with their children fed thanks to free milk. Fathers who had managed to maintain dignity thanks to reduced prices. Elderly people who could afford essential medicines. The revolution of dignity had meanwhile expanded far beyond the confines of the Santana Company. Other Spanish businessmen had begun copying the model, creating a national network of ethical supermarkets that guaranteed basic necessities at accessible prices. The government had studied the Santana case to implement public policies against food poverty, and the European Union had invited Matteo to Brussels to present his model as an example of good social practices. But for Matteo, success was still measured in very concrete terms. Every time he entered one of his supermarkets and saw a mother shopping with a smile instead of anxiously counting coins, every time a child could drink enough milk to grow healthy, every time a family could afford the dignity of choosing what to put in the cart, he knew he had made the right decision. The woman who had returned the milk that first day in Vallecas had become an involuntary symbol of the revolution. Matteo had located her months later and discovered her name was Sarah. She was 24 years old, had 2 small children and a husband who had lost his job in construction. Now Sarah worked as a volunteer coordinator in one of the Santana Foundation's food distribution centers, helping other mothers who found themselves in the situation she had been in. On the second anniversary of the Revolution of Dignity, Matteo and Elena returned together to the Vallecas supermarket where it had all begun. They found Sarah at the checkout, no longer as a customer in difficulty, but as manager of the No Child Without Milk program for the entire neighborhood. Her 2 children, now healthy and grown, were coloring behind the counter while she coordinated the free distribution of children's products. When Sarah saw them arrive, she ran to hug them both with tears in her eyes. She told them that this was the strangest family in the world, an ex-millionaire, a lawyer for the poor, and a single mother who had become her heart sister, but also the truest she had ever known. That night, in their modest but love-filled home, Matteo and Elena looked together at the day's photos. In one of them, the 3 of them, Sarah, Elena, and Matteo, could be seen surrounded by dozens of children eating free ice cream in the supermarket courtyard. Everyone was smiling. Everyone seemed happy. Everyone was part of a revolution that had demonstrated a simple truth. When wealth is put at the service of love instead of greed, it doesn't become poorer, but infinitely richer. Matteo hugged Elena tightly, looking at that photo, thinking about how the sight of a mother forced to return a can of milk had changed not only his company, but his soul. He had lost millions of euros in profits. He had given up unbridled luxury, faced legal battles and fierce criticism, but he had gained something priceless, the certainty of having transformed his life from an empty success into a love full of meaning. And every night, before falling asleep next to the woman who had chosen to love him not for what he owned, but for what he gave away, Matteo thought of all the children who that night went to sleep with full stomachs thanks to his revolution. That was the highest dividend his life had ever produced. Sometimes it's enough to see a mother return milk to understand that your empire is built on the hunger of children. Sometimes the true revolution begins when you choose to lose money to help others gain dignity. And sometimes the greatest love is born when 2 people decide together to change the world, one family at a time, because true wealth isn't counted in the bank, but in the smiles of those who no longer have to choose between eating and living.